What if one geopolitical event thousands of miles away suddenly changed the message being sent to Moscow? In a striking statement, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy pointed to recent events in Iran as a powerful signal for Russian leader Vladimir Putin. As the war in Ukraine enters a prolonged phase, Zelenskyy argues that the fate of powerful regimes can shift faster than many expect. His remarks are not just commentary. They frame the conflict as part of a much larger global struggle shaping the future balance of power. Sometimes a message in geopolitics is not delivered directly. It is delivered through events that the whole world is watching. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy pointed to recent developments in Iran as a strategic signal that leaders in Moscow should pay close attention to. Speaking about the broader consequences of global pressure on authoritarian systems, Zelenskyy argued that political structures which appear stable for decades can shift far faster than many analysts expect once internal strain and international pressure combine. His remarks were made as the war in Ukraine continues more than 4 years after Russia's full-scale invasion began on February 24, 2022. During this period, the conflict has evolved from a regional war into a geopolitical confrontation involving sanctions, military aid, and diplomatic pressure from dozens of countries. Zelensky's argument is not simply about Iran itself. Instead, he is highlighting a broader historical pattern. Regimes that build strong security systems, alliances, and military capabilities can still face sudden turning points when strategic conditions change. By referencing events outside Ukraine, Zelenskyy is framing the war as part of a wider global dynamic, one where shifts in power, alliances, and international pressure can reshape the political landscape far more quickly than many leaders anticipate. In global politics, alliances are tested not by promises, but by what happens when real crises unfold. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy used recent geopolitical tensions to argue that Russia's ability to support its partners is increasingly being questioned. In his remarks, he pointed to examples from the Middle East, suggesting that Moscow's capacity to project power beyond its immediate battlefield has become more limited in recent years. Zelenskyy referenced Russia's long involvement in Syria, where Moscow intervened in 2015 to support the government of Bashar al-Assad. At the height of that intervention, Russia deployed dozens of aircraft and maintained a permanent military presence at the Maiden air base and the naval facility in Taurus. However, analysts note that Russia's strategic focus has shifted significantly since the full-scale war in Ukraine began in February 2022. With a large share of its military resources committed to the Ukrainian front, Zelenskyy suggested that Moscow's ability to act simultaneously in multiple theaters may be under strain. Western defense assessments estimate that hundreds of thousands of Russian troops have been tied to the Ukraine conflict over the past several years, leaving fewer resources available for overseas operations. For Zelenskyy, this pattern raises a broader question. In today's geopolitical environment, how reliable are traditional security guarantees when a major power is deeply absorbed in a prolonged war? One of the clearest signals of a nation's strategic limits is where it must concentrate its forces. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy argues that Russia's current military posture reveals a key reality. The vast majority of its combat resources are now focused on the war in Ukraine. Since the large-scale invasion launched by Vladimir Putin on February 24, 2022, the conflict has evolved into the largest land war in Europe since World War II. Western defense assessments indicate that Russia has deployed hundreds of thousands of personnel to the Ukrainian front over the course of the conflict. According to multiple international estimates, troop levels at various stages of the war have exceeded 400,000 Russian military personnel in and around the theater of operations. Maintaining such a large force requires extensive logistics, equipment, and recruitment systems. Zelenskyy uses this reality to make a broader strategic point. When so much military capacity is tied to a single battlefield, a country's ability to operate simultaneously in other regions becomes more constrained. Analysts note that modern warfare demands not only troops, but also artillery, drones, air defense systems, and constant resupply. For Ukraine's leadership, this concentration of resources illustrates how the conflict has reshaped Russia's strategic priorities and why the outcome of the war carries consequences far beyond Eastern Europe. what if the war in Ukraine is not just a regional conflict, but a turning point for global security? President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has repeatedly argued that the war launched by Vladimir Putin in February 2022 carries consequences far beyond Ukraine's borders. In his view, the conflict represents a broader struggle over international rules, sovereignty, and the future balance of power. Since the invasion began, the scale of international involvement has grown significantly. According to public data from Western governments, Ukraine has received over $100 billion in combined military, financial, and humanitarian support from the United States and European partners. At the same time, Russia has faced one of the most extensive sanctions regimes in modern history, with thousands of restrictions imposed by the European Union, the United States, and allied countries. Zelenskyy argues that these developments show the war is now embedded within a wider geopolitical competition. The outcome, he suggests, could influence how future conflicts are approached and how international norms are enforced. Security analysts often point out that the war has already reshaped defense planning across Europe. NATO members have increased defense spending, and several countries have accelerated military modernization programs. For Zelenskyy, this expanding strategic impact is why the conflict continues to command global attention and why its consequences may extend well beyond the battlefield. In long conflicts, the most important question is not just how wars are fought, but what happens during the pauses. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has expressed caution about the idea that a simple ceasefire would automatically bring lasting stability. Speaking about the future of the conflict with Vladimir Putin's Russia, Zelenskyy suggested that a temporary halt in fighting could allow Moscow time to reorganize its military and restore combat capacity. Since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022, Russia has significantly expanded its defense mobilization. Public data indicates that the Russian government increased its defense spending to more than 6% of GDP in 2024, one of the highest levels in the country's modern history. In addition, Russia has continued large-scale recruitment campaigns and defense industry expansion to sustain its military operations. Zelenskyy argues that such efforts demonstrate how quickly a state can rebuild its armed forces when given time and resources. In his view, a ceasefire without broader political agreements might pause the battlefield but not necessarily resolve the underlying conflict. For Ukraine's leadership, the central concern is whether any pause would lead to a durable settlement or simply create an interval before tensions rise again. That uncertainty is why the debate over ceasefires remains one of the most sensitive issues in international discussions about the war. In prolonged wars, the most decisive battlefield is sometimes not the front line, but the pressure building inside a country itself. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has increasingly pointed to the internal challenges Russia may face as the war continues. According to Zelenskyy, sustaining a large-scale military campaign for several years inevitably creates economic and social strain, even for a country with significant resources. Since the invasion ordered by Vladimir Putin in February 2022, Russia has undertaken major steps to expand its defense capacity. Official Russian budget data shows that military and security spending rose dramatically, with defense expenditures projected to exceed 6% of GDP in 2024. This represents one of the highest levels of military spending in Russia since the end of the Cold War. At the same time, Russia has relied heavily on contract soldiers and volunteer recruitment programs to maintain troop levels. Analysts note that recruitment incentives, including signing bonuses and increased salaries, have been used to attract new personnel as the conflict continues. Zelenskyy argues that the longer the war lasts, the more complex these internal pressures may become. Economic costs, workforce demands, and social expectations all play a role in shaping strategic decisions. For Ukraine's leadership, these internal dynamics are an important factor in understanding how the conflict could evolve in the months and years ahead. In the end, Zelenskyy's message connects global events to the future of the Ukraine war and the broader balance of power. The question now is simple: could these pressures change the direction of the conflict, or will the war continue to reshape global security for years to come? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this analysis useful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more updates. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next report.